Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Shmona Asar, Laws of Shabbos, chapter 18. The conversation still remains on the topic of Hotza'ah Mirshut Lirshut, the malacha of transferring things from one domain to the other. But now the technical elements of this malacha are behind us. All the complex definitions of what's a private domain, what's a public domain, the different types of domains, that's all behind us. Today we're spending all of our time on the idea of shi'ur. Besides for the act of carrying, the carrying has to be what's called significant, according to halacha. It has to be, you have to carry enough of a given item in order to hold you liable. If, let's say, you carry out apples from your house to the street, if the amount of the apple that you're carrying is insignificant according to Jewish law, the entire act of carrying is not considered biblically problematic. We're going to see later that if you carry out chatzishi or less than the amount, there's a rabbinic issue with that. But biblically, we can't hold you accountable for that. So the Rambam, in his definition of all of Jewish law, has to make a list and tell you exactly how much of any given item may not be carried out on the Shabbos to hold you liable for this malacha of Hotza'ah Mirshut Lirshut. And that's what the 20 so halachot of today's chapter are focused on, literally a list of many different types of items and their shiurim. So here we go. Halacha Aleph, hamotzi davar mirshut hayachid lirshut harabim or mirshut harabim lirshut hayachid. One who transfers, takes out something from a private domain to a public domain, or the opposite, from a public domain to a private domain, eino chayav. He's not biblically liable ad sheyotzi mimenu shi'ur shemu'il klum, unless he takes out from this given item an amount which is somewhat beneficial. Ve'elu hein shiurei ha'hotza'ah, and the following are the amounts for holding you liable for carrying. Hamotzi ochlei adam. The general principle is that one who takes food that's fit for human consumption, the amount that makes you liable is kigro geret, the size of a dried fig. Dried fig right here on the screen. Umitztarfin zeim zeh. The thing with food is that different foods can combine to create the volume of a dried fig. So if you're taking out apples and pears, you don't have to take out a dried fig of an apple and a dried fig of a pear. You could take out half a dried fig of an apple, half a dried fig of a pear, and together, since you've taken out the volume of a dried fig of human food, you're held liable. V'hu, that's provided that the volume of the dried fig is created from the substance of the food itself. Chutz min haklipim v'hagarinin v'hauktzin v'hasubin v'hamursan, excluding the shells, the seeds, the stems, the coarse bran, and the fine bran. So again, if using the apple as the example, if you only have the volume of the dried fig together with the peel of the apple and that brown little stem that sticks out on the top, you're not liable. Only if you have a dried fig of the actual apple itself, that's when you're held liable. And now the Rambam goes through many other foods that, although they are fit for human consumption, have a different shi'ur because their level of beneficiality is not just in human consumption. There are other things that they can be used for, and as soon as you take that amount of this given food, you're already held liable. Starts the Rambam yayin. Wine kedei rova revi'it. The amount to hold you liable is a quarter of a revi'it. A revi'it is the typical amount in Torah which is considered viable for drinking. That's about 3 ounces or so. A quarter of that revi'it is what holds you liable for wine. Why? Because typically wine was diluted with water at a ratio of 3 to 1. So in your average cup of a revi'it of wine, you actually had only a quarter of a revi'it of wine and 3/4 water. So the amount of wine that's considered beneficial to create a drink is a quarter of a revi'it. Ve'im haya karush, if it was congealed wine, then it turns into food, bikazayit, and the amount that holds you liable is an olive size of wine. Chalev behemat tahora, milk from a kosher animal, kedei gmiya, enough to take a gulp. You're already liable for that. Chalev tmeya, milk of a non-kosher animal which cannot be eaten, the beneficiality of it is actually used in an eye salve, kedei lichol ayin achat, enough of this milk to paint one eye with this medical concoction. Chalev isha veloven beitza, a woman's milk, and the white of an egg, kedei litein b'mishifa, enough to also mix into mishifa, as the commentaries explain, a type of medication compress that was also made for the eyes. Shemen, how much oil does one have to take out to be liable? Kedei lasuch etzba ktana shel regel katan ben yomo, to be able to anoint the pinky of the child of the foot of a child who was born that day. So a 1-day-old newborn, his pinky, his baby toe. Tal, how much dew it holds you liable? Kedei lashuf et hakilorim, is enough to serve as a base for an eye ointment. The kilor, and this eye ointment as it's created, kedei lashuf b'mayim, it has to be enough to be able to be mixed with water and applied to the eye as it usually was. Umayim, one who takes out water, kedei lirchotz pnei medocha, enough water just to wash the inside of a mortar is already considered beneficial and holds you liable. Dvash, honey, kedei litein al rosh hakatit, enough to put on a wound. The commentaries explain this was referring to donkeys who were used to carrying heavy saddles, ultimately the saddles would scratch into their backs and create some kind of a wound, and you would apply honey as a form of medication. So the amount of honey that's required to smear onto the donkey's wound is enough to hold you liable for carrying. Dam, ush'ar kol ha'mashkin v'chol ha'shofchin, blood, any other liquid, and sewage water, kedei revi'it, about 3 ounces, again a quarter of a log, is the amount that holds you liable. Halakha Gimel, we move on now to things that are not fit for human consumption, but more fit for animal consumption. Teven tivua, straw created from grain, kimlo pi para. The amount you have to carry to be liable is enough to fill a cow's mouth. Teven kitniot, the straw from legumes, from beans. Kimlo pi gamal is enough to fill the mouth of a camel who would typically eat this type of stuff. But if in a specific instance you took out straw from legumes, not to feed a camel, with the express intent to feed a cow, kimlo pi para, then the amount changes, and you'll only be held liable if you take out enough to fill a cow's mouth. Because in Jewish law, eating that's done from a place of pressure, in other words, you wouldn't usually eat it, but under specific circumstances, if you had to, you would eat it, it's considered eating. And since a cow might sometimes eat straw made from legumes, so if you took it out with that intent, then you have to take out enough to fill the cow's mouth to be liable. Amir they translate over here is straws that come from the ears of grain. Kimlo pi taleh is enough to fill a sheep's mouth who would typically eat this stuff. Asavim, fresh grass. Kimlo pi gdi, enough to fill a goat's mouth. Alei shum v'alei betzalim, leaves of garlic and leaves of onion plants, im hayulachim, if they were moist, kigrogeret, they're fit for human consumption, and the amount that holds you liable for taking them out is the volume of a dried fig, because they're fit for human consumption. Biveshim, if they're dry, only fit for animals, kimlo pigdi, you have to take out enough to fill a goat's mouth. When it comes to this list and this halacha, which is animal consumption foods, we don't say, like when it comes to the human foods, that a number of different substances can combine to create the amount required for liability. Why? Because there are different amounts. Some are bigger, some are smaller. So we only combine them to the stricter amount, never to the more lenient amount. I'm sorry, the opposite. We never combine them to the strict amount, we only combine them to the lenient amount. Says the Rambam, Ketzah, what does that look like? Hotzi teven tvua v'kitnit. If you were to carry out a combination of straw made from grain and straw made from legumes, im yesh bishnehem kimlo pi para, if the combination of the two equals enough to fill a cow's mouth, patur, then you're exempt. Kimlo pi gamal, but if you had enough to fill a camel's mouth, which is more, now chayav, now you are liable. In other words, it's more lenient. Straw made from legumes is more lenient. You need more straw of legumes to obligate you in the malacha of carrying. So only if the combination of the grain straw and the legume straw equals to the bigger amount, which is more lenient in this case, then you're liable, otherwise you're exempt. The same rule applies to anything similar when it comes to Shabbos. If there's two things that have different amounts, they combine only to the more lenient amount. One who carries wood. You have to have enough wood to put under a fire that it would cook partially the amount of a dried fig from a hen's egg, as it's beaten in oil and placed in the frying pan. In other words, here you see on the screen an egg that's being fried, partially done. An egg is bigger than a grogeret. The volume of an egg is bigger than the volume of a dried fig. If you cook the volume of a dried fig out of the egg with this wood, that's already enough to hold you liable. Hamotzi kaneh, somebody who takes out a reed, the amount that will hold him liable is if he takes enough to make a quill or a pen, which is very short, will only reach the top of his fingers, as you see here in the picture. But if it's a thick reed or it's a crushed reed which cannot be used for a feather, it's treated like wood, and if you take out enough that can be used in the cooking process of an egg that will cook up of the volume of a dried fig from within that egg, then you're liable. Halacha hey hamotzi tavlin, one who takes out spices. You're liable if you take out the amount that can spice an egg. Different types of spices, again, combined with each other. Pilpel, one who takes out peppercorn. Kolshehu, even the slightest amount holds you liable. Itran is pine sap. We had this earlier in the laws of lighting Shabbat candles. Also kolshehu, even the slightest amount holds you liable. Reach tov, something which smells good. Kolshehu, even the slightest amount is beneficial. Reach ra, something with a bad smell, an unpleasant fragrance, also kolshehu, even the slightest amount holds you liable. Minei besamim, different types of perfumes, kol shehein, also the slightest amount. Argaman tov, beautiful purple dye, kolshehu, the slightest amount also holds you liable. Betulat havered, rosebuds, you see a picture of a rosebud. Achat, just one bud is considered beneficial and holds you liable. Minei matachot hakashim, tough metals, go nechoshet ubarzel, like copper and iron, Kol shehein, even the slightest amount is considered beneficial, and if you carry it, you're liable. Me'afar mizbeach or me'avnei mizbeach, if a person were to carry from the earth of the mizbeach. Here we see the mizbeach as it was in the temple, and while it looks covered and nicely painted, the truth is that the inside of the mizbeach was hollow, and it was made out of earth, and it was attached to the earth. Mizbach adama ta'aseli, the Torah says the mizbeach on the outside in the temple should be made out of earth. Sometimes the stones or the earth that would make up the mizbeach would chip and crumble. So if somebody takes the dust of the mizbeach or the stones of the mizbeach, umimekek sfarim umimekek mitpachot shalahen, and of the decay of Torah scrolls or the decay of the cloths covering the Torah scrolls, since these are considered holy and important, kol shehein, even the slightest amount is considered beneficial, and you're liable for carrying. Because people typically put these away to be buried in an honorable way, and even the slightest amount is important. Gachelet, one who takes out a coal, kol shehu, even the slightest amount is beneficial. Hamotzi shal hevet, one who takes out simply a flame. Let's say he painted his hand with something flammable and then lights it, and so he's carrying out a flame. Since it has no substance, patur, one is exempt. It's a very interesting topic without getting too deeply into it. In typical halacha, when we talk about amounts, kol shehu is not considered an amount. The slightest amount is not an amount. It has to be a definable amount, which qualifies as a shiur. And the Rebbe once explained that the reason why over here we do find the idea of a kol shehu is because the kol shehu being expressed here is different than the kol shehu in the rest of halacha. When you say the slightest amount, you can be saying two things. The slightest amount, with the emphasis on the word amount. We just can't define how much that amount is, so you just say as soon as you have the slightest amount, you're already in the area of that amount. Or kol shehu is a human way of saying just beyond nothing. In other words, we have no way to say that even the most minute, infinitesimal bit is forbidden, so we say kol shehu to bring out that point. It has no real amount, but the only way we can define it in human terms is by saying kol shehu. For example, by avodah zarah, we saw earlier in the first book of the Rambam, the Torah says, v'lo yidbak biyadcha me'uma min hacherem. Nothing can come to you from the consecrated things that were worshipped for idols. Over there, the concept is that literally nothing, an infinitesimal amount of avodah zarah cannot enter your property. We have no way to say it, so we say kol shehu. Here, when it comes to Shabbat, since the idea is that it provides benefit, the amount that holds you liable for carrying is an amount that provides benefit. In these cases, when you have something that smells good, for example, or a good purple dye, even the smallest amount provides a benefit. And therefore, that's the amount that holds you liable for carrying on Shabbat. Halacha vav hamotzi zeronei gina. Somebody who carries garden seeds, which cannot be eaten by humans, shiuran pachot mikigrogeret. Their amount will be less than human foods, less than the volume of a dried fig. For example, mizera kishuin. If you were carrying out seeds of cucumbers, shnayim, just 2 cucumber seeds would hold you liable, going in order of the picture from left to right. Mizera hadluin, seeds of gourds, type of pumpkin or squash, shnayim, also 2 seeds hold you liable. Mizera pol hamitzri, Egyptian lima beans, shnayim, 2 of those beans would hold you liable. Hamotzi subin, one who takes out coarse bran, kedelitein al pikur shel tzorfei zahav, is the amount that's required to put on the mouth of a golden crucible. Oh, I had a picture here. It seems like it doesn't come up on the screen. But the idea is that they used to have these round little pieces where inside there was a very hot flaming fire. They would put gold inside of it to heat. And there would be a hole that would run through the thickness of the stone surrounding it, through which a kind of a fan could be blown through to create air that would put more pressure on the gold and help melting it. So that hole is called the pikur shel tzorfei zahav, the mouth of the crucible used by goldsmiths. And if you have enough of this coarse bran to cover that hole, that holds you liable. Hamotzi mursan, somebody who takes out finer bran could be fit for human consumption. So im la'achila, if the intent of taking it out was for eating, shiro kigrogeret, the amount follows other human foods, the volume of a dried fig. Libehema, but if it's for an animal, shiro kim lo pigdi, the amount that will hold you liable is to fill a goat's mouth. Litzvia, if you took the fine bran for dyeing, kedei litzboa beged katan, you need to have enough to be able to create from that a dye that will dye a very small piece of clothing. In halacha, typically this is defined as a hairnet, svacha, that was used on top of women's heads. Lulvei zradin vehecharuvin. If you have young vine shrubs, that's the second picture from the left here, and carobs. Ad shelo yamtiku, in their growth process, if they haven't yet become sweet, kigrogeret, then they're still fit for human consumption, and the volume that's required to hold you liable is the volume of a dried fig. Umishe yamtiku, but once they become sweet, and now they're only fit for animal consumption, kimlo pigdi, the amount that holds you liable is the amount to fill a goat's mouth. Aval haluf, but a type of onion, just put a red onion here, but it's a species of onion, is the luf. V'hachardal, and mustard seed, all the way on the right. V'hatur musin, and a very tough bean. It's not clear exactly which bean this is, but it has a very tough shell. It would go through multiple processes of cooking before it could become fit for eating. Usha'ar kol hanichbashin, and anything else which could be pickled. Ben sheyamtiku, ben ad shelo yamtiku, whether they're in their growth process after they've become sweet or before, they're all fit for human consumption because they can be pickled and cooked to a state when a human can eat them. And therefore the shiur that holds you liable is kigrogeret, the size of a dried fig. Halacha Zayin says the Rambam hamotzi gar inin, somebody who transfers any other type of seeds. Im la'achila, if he's doing it for purposes of eating, chamesh, 5 is considered beneficial. V'im lahasaka, if it's for the purposes of being used for cooking or for firewood, harehin ke'etzim, they're treated like wood, which the amount is enough to cook the volume of a dried fig from within a hen's egg. V'im lecheshbon, if they're being used for calculation, you want to count money against them or something like that, shtayim, 2 already becomes important. V'im lizriya, if they're being used for replanting, shtayim, again, 2 becomes important. Hamotzi ezov, one who transfers hyssop. This is one species of hyssop that you see here on the screen. La'acholim. If you're transferring the hyssop to eat it, kigrogeret, the amount that holds you liable is the volume of a dried fig. Libehema, if it's for an animal to eat, kimlo pigdi, the amount to fill a goat's mouth holds you liable. Le'etzim, if it's being used for wood, for firewood, kishiur ha'etzim, it follows the amount of regular wood. Lahazaya, if it's being used for sprinkling, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is the mitzvah of para aduma, the red heifer, which was used in the process of purifying somebody from corpse impurity. Part of that was sprinkling certain water with the azov, with the hyssop plant. So if you're taking out this plant to use in the process of sprinkling of the para aduma, kishiur hazaya, then you have to take out the measure that's acceptable for sprinkling. We're going to learn later in the 10th book of the Rambam, in the laws of para aduma, that the azov has to be a certain height, enough to be able to dip into the water and retain the water when you take it out of the vessel. So that's the amount that would hold you liable on Shabbat. Halacha chet, hamotzi klipe egozin, one who takes out walnut shells in the bottom right there. Uklipe rimonim, top right, the pomegranate shells. Istis upu'ah. Istis is called woad. That's the plant there on the bottom left, the yellow plant. And pu'ah, some say, is referring to madder root. It's on the top left there. It helps to create a red dye. Ush'ar hatzva'in, or any other things which can be used in the process of creating dye. Kedei litzboa bahen beged katan. You have to take out enough that can create enough dye to dye a small piece of clothing, as I mentioned before, kisvacha, the size of a hairnet, shemanichina habanot al rashehen, which young girls used to put onto their heads. Here you have a bit of a primitive picture of what this svacha used to look like. It would go on the heads of certain young girls. If somebody would to transfer urine that's 40 days old, it was used as a certain type of laundry detergent, or netar Alexandria, or what's called Alexandrian niter, also a cleaning agent on the top right there, o borit, or regular soap, kimonya ve'ashlag. These are other cleaning agents, not clear exactly what the translation is. Ush'ar kol hamenakin, or any other agent that can be used for cleaning. Kedei lechabes bahen beged katan kisvacha, the amount that would hold you liable is if you took out enough that could be used in the laundering of that small piece of clothing, that svacha, that I showed you before. Hotzi samanin shruyin, if somebody were to take out herbs that are soaking and are in the process of being created into a dye, here you have to take out enough to dye an example or a sample that would be shown to a weaver for whatever type of, let's say you wanted to weave a cloth with that specific dye, you have to have enough that would be able to dye a sample. Halakha tet, hamotzi dio al hakulmus. If you take out ink as it's attached to the feather, to the quill, shiuro kedei lichtov mimenu shtei otiyot. There has to be enough ink on the quill to be able to write from it 2 letters. But if you took out the ink on its own, say an ink block or an ink well, there has to be enough, there has to be more than that in the ink well. Enough ink that if I were to dip a quill into it, it would take out enough ink to write 2 letters. It has to be a little more than that, which would create the pool for the quill to dip in. If there was only in the inkwell enough to write 1 letter, and on the quill there was already ink to write a second letter, or in the case of the ink block, not the ink well, there was enough in the ink that was being taken out to write 1 letter, and the ink on the quill was for the second letter, now we're in doubt. And we can't hold you biblically liable. If you took out enough ink to write 2 letters, but you wrote them while you're walking, so you never transferred in a fully forbidden way enough ink to potentially write 2 letters because you already made the letters while you're walking. Nevertheless, chayav, you're liable. Ktivatan zuhi hanachatan. Very interesting. The writing of the letters is considered the placing. Remember from earlier chapters, every type of carrying to be forbidden biblically has to have an akira and a hanacha, a lifting and a placing. Typically, the lifting and placing happens when you carry. You simply lift it up from one domain, put it in another. If you lifted up the ink from one domain and wrote it onto a paper, the writing onto the paper is considered to be the hanacha. Hotziot achat uktava. If you took out enough for one letter and wrote it on your way, and you took out enough for a second letter and then wrote it on your way, patur, we can't hold you liable biblically, you're exempt. By the time you took out the second letter of ink, the first one was already placed down in the other domain on the paper. Halacha yud, one who takes out a blue eye paint, whether it's being used in healing or simply as a beautifier, as a makeup, the amount you have to take out to be liable is enough to paint one eye. But if there's a place where the custom is that you don't just do one eye, you put always makeup on 2 eyes, and you took out this blue paint for the purposes of makeup, and then of course you're only held liable if you take out the amount which could paint 2 eyes. Zefet, the gofri, tar and sulfur, if you take out these materials, enough to make a hole. Make a hole meaning, as the commentaries explain it, sealing a hole with these substances. Sha'ava, if a person takes out wax, you have to have enough wax to also seal a small hole. Devek, if one carries glue, in order to place on top of the bird trap. Commentaries explain it refers to a picture something like this. People would put up a tall pole with another pole laying horizontally, and they would lay glue on this pole with also some bird feed. And when birds would come to eat, their feet would get stuck to the trap, and you'd be trapped. You have a bird. So that's the amount of glue that's considered beneficial and holds you liable on Shabbos. Revav, fat, enough to paint the amount of a sela coin under a wafer. Before putting a wafer onto an oven or onto a surface to bake, they would kind of layer it with this fat. And so there has to be enough to put that amount of fat under this wafer. Halacha yud aleph hamotzi adama, somebody who takes out earth, red clay, kedei la'asot chotam ha'igeret, enough to make a seal for a letter. They used to roll up letters and put a seal of earth on it to show that it wasn't opened. Tit, one who takes out mud, kedei la'asot pikur, enough to form that hole that I mentioned before, the hole of the crucible of the goldsmith. There has to be enough mud to form that hole. Zevelok choldak, one who takes out animal manure, or thin sand, enough to fertilize one leek. Cholgas, that's a leek right over there. So that's leek when it's cut off. While they're growing, you fertilize it with this stuff. Cholgas, one who takes out a thick sand, enough to mix into a spoonful of people who would make lime. That's the lime that you have over there, and it was used to create like a kind of a plaster. And so when you would mix the thick sand into it, it would become a proper mixture. That amount of thick sand holds you liable. Charsit, one who takes out firm clay, again to make the size of the mouth of that golden crucible. Se'ar, one who carries hair, enough to mix with mud to make the size of that hole of the goldsmith's crucible. Sid, one who takes out plaster lime itself, apparently it was also used in makeup, so enough to cover the pinky of a young girl. It was kind of used to make the skin look tighter. Once you would put it up, you would layer it and then you would take it off, and it would make the skin look smoother. So that's the amount that's considered beneficial. Afar va'efer, dirt and ash. Before we spoke about dirt from the Mizbeach, that's important earth. Here we're speaking about regular earth. And ash, dam tzipor ktana, enough to cover the blood of a small bird. Later we're going to learn in the 5th book of the Rambam, when you slaughter any undomesticated animal or a bird, you have to do after the shchita what's called kisui hadam, covering the blood. And you cover the blood with dirt or ash. So that's enough, that's considered beneficial, enough to cover the blood of a small bird. Tzror even, a pebble, a rock pebble, big enough, it has to be big enough to throw at an animal and it'll feel it. Which is the weight of 10 zuz coins that were used in those days. Cheres, a shard of earthenware pottery, has to be big enough to be able to hold a revi'it of liquid. Halacha yudbet, hamotzi chevel, one who takes out a rope, has to be big enough to be held liable, to make a handle for a box. Gemi, if one takes out a reed, this is different than the other reed that we mentioned before for making a feather. That's more of a thicker, roundish reed. This is a flat reed. The flat reed was used to make also a type of a handle for a sifter or a sieve. Some say it means a hook. You can see on the top right, the sieve is hanging by a hook. That's a tlai according to other opinions. Others say it means like a handle, literally, for a sieve. Hutzin, if someone takes out palm branches, you have to take out enough branches to create the handle for an Egyptian basket. The Egyptian baskets were woven out of also palm branches, and their handles were also. So if there's enough palm branches to make the handle of the basket, that holds you liable. Sieve, palm bast, that's the fibers that grow around the palm tree. Enough to place over a small funnel of wine. Muchin, unprocessed wool. Enough to make a ball of yarn big enough the size of a walnut. Etzem, one transfers bone. Tarvad, has to be big enough to make a bone out of it, a spoon out of it. That's a spoon out of bone on the top left over there. Schuchit, one who carries glass. It has to be enough to sharpen the head of a kirkar. Kirkar is a weaver's needle. We spoke before earlier in chapter 7 about how weaving used to work. You had a bunch of threads that were lined on the warp, and they could be very close together. And so you have to use the kirkar to separate them to make sure that they're all flat and smooth. So this kirkar had to be super sharp to be able to separate between different threads. So you would use glass to sharpen it. So if you have enough glass to sharpen the head of this kirkar, that holds you liable. Or it's sharp enough, the glass, that it can slice through two threads at once. If somebody is transferring hair from the tail of a horse or the tail of a cow, and you take just two strands, chayav, that's considered beneficial and it holds you liable. If you took out just one strand of the tough part of a pig's tail, chayav, you're also liable. Fibers from a date palm. These are not the palm bast, these are more the longer fibers. The strings on the tree. Shtayim, just two holds you liable. Chorei dekel, the bark of the palm. Behin klipei hachariyot, which is called the shell of the branches, not the bark of the actual tree. But if you ever see a piece of schach that you use to cover a sukkah, in the middle there's that thick middle. That's called the chorei dekel. Achat, just one of those is enough to hold you liable. I think I had a picture of these. Yeah, that's the nitzrei dekel on the side there, and the top is the sieve, the palm bast. Okay. Mitzemer gefen u mitzemer kalach, one who carries out cotton or silk. Or the wool from camels or from rabbits here. And chayash bayam is an animal in the sea. In other words, it's a sea creature that could have some type of hair, unlike regular fish. Ush'ar kol hanitvin, or any other material which could be spun into thread. You have to carry enough of this material to be able to spin a thread that would be 4 tvachim long, between 12 and 16 inches. A person who carries part of a cloth or part of sackcloth or part of a piece of leather. The amount that's considered legally important when it comes to contracting ritual impurity is the same amount that holds you liable for carrying. In the 10th book of the Rambam, we're going to have this at length. The Rambam says, habeged shlosha al shlosha. A piece of cloth to contract ritual impurity has to be at least 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, a square. Hasak for sackcloth, it's arba'al arba'al, 4 by 4 finger breadths. Ha'or, when it's leather, chamisha chamisha, it's 5 by 5 finger breadths. So the same way to contract ritual impurity, it has to have that amount. So too for Shabbat, to hold you liable, you have to carry that amount of cloth, sackcloth, or leather. If you carry out a hide of an animal that has not been processed at all, it rather is still soft and pliable, the amount is enough to wrap a small weight, the weight of a shekel. They used to use weights in buying and selling. You'd put a weight on one side of the scale and the product on the other side of the scale, and it would equal out. And they used to wrap these weights so they shouldn't get rusty very quickly. So unprocessed leather, hide, enough to wrap a small shekel weight. Hayam maluach, if it was in the process of being processed, and the Rambam identifies a few stages in the process of hide. First is when you salt it. You pour salt on it. We had a picture of this the other day. Of salted hide. But it was not yet treated with flour or with galnut juice. So now, it's not just unprocessed hide, it could be used for writing amulets, and you have to carry enough hide to write an amulet. If it was already processed not just with salt, but also with flour, but it had not yet been treated with galnut juice, which was the third and final stage, it's now fit to write a divorce document on it, and you have to take out that amount big enough to write a divorce document to hold you liable. Nigmar ibudo, once you finish the process, you also did the galnut juice treatment, now it becomes like regular leather, and shiuro, the amount to hold you liable, was in the last halacha, chamisha al chamisha, 5 finger breadths by 5 finger breadths. Halacha tetvav hamotzi klaf me'ubad. One who takes out klaf, which was worked. Remember, we had the 3 stages of hide. Once you process it, if it's still as is, it's called gevil. Then if you split it into 2, the inner half is called the klaf, the outer half is called the duchsustus. Others say it's the opposite. But here we'll go with the simple meaning. So if you take out klaf, processed klaf, that's the inner hide of a split open hide, it has to be big enough to write the entire portion of Shema until uvisharecha. Duchsustus, if you take out the outer half of the processed hide, that was used for writing a mezuzah, so you have to take out enough to write a whole mezuzah, which is both the parsha of Shema and the Hayayim Shamoah. Niyar, one who carries paper, enough to write on it 2 letters of the customs receipt. The customs officer, people used to go through customs, have their baggage checked, and they have a receipt that was written down by those that were collecting taxes for the customs. So-and-so passed through our booth, and he's okay. So you have to have enough paper to write 2 letters of that receipt. Now, why is that important? Because the customs receipts were written in bigger letters than the average letters. So the paper size is a bit bigger. Hamotzi kesher mochsin, one who carries the actual receipt of the customs officer. Chayav, you're liable. Even though one might think it's useless, because you already showed it to where you have to show it to. You've used it to become exempt from paying your taxes or whatever, and now it has no use. So why should I be liable? Says the Rambam, Sharei Rayahi le'olam. The IRS can come to take, to check your taxes at any time. So you always want to have that tax receipt that you already paid, whatever you had to pay, so you will hold on to it for longer. And therefore, if you carry that receipt on Shabbos, you are liable. Hamotzi shtar parua u'niyar machuk. One who takes out a document which has already been paid, a loan document which was already paid, or paper that had been erased. Unlike today, our erasing technology is much more sophisticated. But in those days, if you erased stuff written on paper, it always retained this dark mark. So it's not useful in writing. So the amount that will hold you liable is kedei lichroch al pitz lochit ktana shel palyaton, enough to wrap on the top of a small bottle of perfume. V'im yesh ba lo ven shelo. But if there's part of the loan document which is still blank, or part of the erased paper which is still fully blank, and you can write on it 2 letters of the bigger font of the taxpayer, of the customs officer's receipts, chayav, then you're also liable because you've taken out enough paper to provide you benefit. Halachat zayin hamotzi behema chayav of. One who carries an animal, an undomesticated animal, or a bird. Afal pishehin chayim, even though they're still alive, chayav, you are liable. Aval adam chay eino masoy, but a live human, if you were to carry another person and he's alive on your shoulders, it's not considered to be a load. The Rebbe has a fascinating talk here. The Talmud says that the reason why a live person is not considered a load is because chay nosei et atzmo. A live person carries his own weight. You're not carrying any weight. However, the animals, even if they're live, the Talmud says mishar b'tei nafshayu. They're always pulling themselves downwards. Mystically, it has a very deep connotation. The Shlomo HaMelech says in Kohelet, ruach habehema yoredeti lemata. The spirit of the animal always descends downwards. Ruach ha'adam olahi lemala. The spirit of the human always ascends upwards. And in Kabbalah, we talk about the 2 parts of our soul. We have an animalistic soul and a godly soul. The animalistic part of our soul is always going down. The godly part of our soul is always striving upwards. So the Rambam is teaching us that you have to every person deals with their animal. For some, the animal is very coarse, like a behema, a real ox, a goring ox. Some people are able to take the power of their animal soul and translate it, channel it for holy things. Then it becomes a chaya. The animal is alive because it has holy life in it. Some can even succeed in transferring their entire animal soul into an of, which flies. There's an ascension happening in your animal soul. Nevertheless, the Rambam reminds us that no matter what you've done to your animal soul, they remain animals. They'll always carry down their weight. They're always seeking to go down. Ruach habehema yoredeti lemata. But as long as you're dealing with the Adam, the human within yourself, the godly part of yourself, chay nosei et atzmo, the live carries himself, and you're not obligated for carrying on Shabbat because he carries his own weight. Kafut o choleh, says the Rambam, if the person on your shoulder was tied up, so he cannot carry his own weight, or he was sick, hamotzi oto chayav, then you are liable for carrying him. V'ha'isha medada et b'na, a woman can walk her child, hold on to her child while he's walking, bizman shenotel achat u'maniach achat, provided that the baby is actually picking up one foot and putting down the other. You can't drag your baby along in the street. That's considered carrying. But if the baby is actively taking one step after another, then you're okay. Halacha Yud Zayin Hamotzi Tinok Chai V'Kis Talui B'Tzavaro. If you carry out a live baby and he has some kind of a pouch hanging from his neck, so for carrying the live baby, you're not liable. Live people carry their own weight. But because there's a pouch, chayav mishum akis, you're liable on account of the pouch. She'ein akis tefillah latinok, because in this case, we don't see the pouch as being secondary to the baby. Aval im hotzi et hagadol. But let's say you carried out an adult, afal pishu melubash b'kelav v'tabotav biyado, even though he's wearing many clothes and many rings on his fingers, patur, you're exempt. Shehakol tefillah lo. When it comes to an adult, everything that he's wearing is considered secondary to him, and since for the person you're not held liable, for all of his clothing you're also not held liable. If, however, this adult had clothes folded over his shoulder, he's not wearing it, it cannot be considered secondary to him. And when you carry the person, you're liable on account of the clothing. If a person carries a locust, if the locust is alive, even the slightest amount holds you liable. Umet, if it's a dead locust, and now it's fit for human consumption, because some locusts are kosher. Kigrogeret, then it has to be the volume of human foods, the dried fig. Tziporet kramim, it's a type of locust. Some say it's the yellow locust, some say it's the red one. Ben chaya, ben meta, whether it's alive or dead. Kol shehu, the slightest amount already holds you liable, because this type of locust was also used in medication. People would hide it, put it away for medicine. And for medicine, even the slightest amount can be beneficial. And therefore anything like it also goes into that category. If it's medicinal, even carrying the slightest amount holds you liable. A corpse of a human being, a carcass of an animal or a rodent, here too we see the link between ritual impurity and carrying on Shabbos. The amount that would contract ritual impurity is the amount that holds you liable on Shabbos. In the case of a corpse, an animal carcass, kazayit, an olive size. B'sheretz, if it's a rodent, ka'adasha, the size of a lentil. We're referring here to the 8 special rodents in the Torah, the Shmona Shratzim that I've shown on these slides multiple times. Halacha yutet hayasham kazayit mitzumtzam. If there was exactly an olive size of this animal carcass or human corpse flesh, v'hotzi mimenu kechatzi zayit, and you only carried half of the olive size, chayav, says the Rambam, you're biblically liable. Because you have done something beneficial, even if the amount you're holding in your hand is not beneficial to anything, to accomplish anything. But by separating the two half olive sizes, now you have reduced the amount of corpse flesh or animal carcass from being able to transmit ritual impurity to other things. So you've done something, you've accomplished something beneficial. But if you had a kazayit and a half, there was an olive and a half size of corpse flesh, and you took away only half, you haven't done anything. Patur, now you're exempt, because the kazayit remains, it will still transmit ritual impurity, and the half a piece of corpse flesh that you're holding in your hand also has no legal power. The same principle would apply to any other impurities. If you reduce the amount, then even though what you have in your hand is less than the required amount, you have accomplished something and it's liable for Shabbos. Halacha chaf. Now the Rambam gives a general caveat to the entire chapter. When are we saying all of these rules? That you're only going to be held liable if you carry the requisite amount of each individual item. That's only k'she'otzi stam, if you carried it out by default with no specific intent. But if you took something out with the intent to plant it, or to use in medicine, or to show a sample of this thing, and anything like it, chayav b'kolshehu, you are going to be held liable even for the slightest amount, because the slightest amount can be used in planting, in samples, and in medicine. Halacha chaf aleph hamatzniya davar lizri'ah, or lirefuah, or lidugma. Let's say you did put something away to be used for planting, for medicine, for samples, and therefore even the slightest amount would hold you liable. But then v'shachach lama hitznio. On Shabbos itself, you forgot why you put it away, v'hotzio stam, and when you took it out with no specific intention. Now, chayav alav b'kolshehu. Nevertheless, you remain liable even for the slightest amount. Because we assume that you're taking it out to fulfill the purpose you had originally intended. But if somebody else were to take it out, of course they're only going to be held liable for taking out the proper requisite amount, because they didn't put it away with the intent to be used for medicine or whatnot. Let's say the person took it out and then threw it back into the storage room where the rest of it was sitting. Even though the place, you know where it is, you can identify that slight amount, By putting it back, you take away the original intent, and now it reverts essentially, back to being used for the regular use, which then will hold you liable on the regular amount. Therefore, if you were to take it back in, you're only going to be held liable if you take in the amount that would typically be used in the case of the given item. Let's say you have something which people wouldn't usually hide, and also it's not fitting to be hid. Like menstrual blood. If somebody did put it away with a specific intent and then took it out, chayav, he will be held liable because he has a weird thought, and Torah gives power to that weird thought. However, everybody else will be held exempt. Because people are only held liable for carrying something which is normal to be hidden and is befitting to be hidden. Halacha Chav Gimel, now we go to the topic of Chatzi Shiur. Till now we've been talking about the Shiur, the requisite amount that holds you liable for carrying on Shabbos. What happens if you took out any item less than the requisite amount? Hamotzi Chatzi Shiur, one who takes out half, and half is just a term, it means anything less than the full amount. Patur, you are exempt. Anybody who does any of the 39 labors, only committing the half of the requisite amount. Remember, throughout these last couple of chapters, the Rambam defined all the malachot, how much has to be done of each individual act, and you only did half of the act. Patur, you're exempt. Let's say you took out half an amount of something, of wine, let's say. Then you went back and took out the other half. Chayav, now you're going to be held liable because you now have done a complete act of taking something out. Unlike the writing, by the way, we took out a quill, wrote one letter, then a quill and second letter. Over there, the ink is considered to have disappeared. It isn't sitting there waiting to be attached to the other piece of ink. Here you have one full item, you brought out half, and then you brought out the second half. But if you picked up the first half, the original half, before placing down the second half, the first half is treated as though it was burnt up, and you're held exempt because you never have a full act of hotza'ah. If you took out half of an amount and you placed it, so you did a full akira v'hanacha to half an amount. You went back and took the second half. You didn't put it down next to the first half. You just passed it over the airspace of the first half within 3 tfachim. We've seen many times in these chapters, any time you bring something within the area of 3 tfachim, it's considered to be attached. So by placing the second half over the airspace of the first half in a space of 3 tfachim, chayav, now you're liable. Because when you move things, it's like placing it onto something, and it's as if you've placed it onto the other half, since it's attached by the space of less than 3 tfachim. But if you were to throw it and it passed over the airspace of the first half, you're only going to be held liable once it comes to rest on something next to the first half. Let's say you're inadvertent. You didn't know it's Shabbos today, or you didn't know carrying is forbidden on the Shabbos. And in one state of inadvertence, in other words, in one state of unawareness, you took out first one half and then a second half. Lirshut achat, if you brought both halves into one domain, chayav, you're liable. Lishtei reshuyot, but if you took out the two halves to two separate domains, im yesh beinehen, reshut shechayavin aleha, if between them there's another domain, which had you passed it through that domain, you'd be held liable, as we saw in the earlier chapters. What defines different domains? Patur, then you're exempt, because you haven't done a complete hotza'ah. They're not considered combined. In order to combine these two, you have to pass it through a third domain, which is considered separate. Hayta beinehen karmelit, but if between these two domains was a karmelit, harehen kirshut achat, since by biblical law they're all considered connected, so they're all considered to be one domain, v'chayav chatat, and because you did the act inadvertently, you're liable for bringing a sin offering. Halacha chaf hei hamotzi pachot mikashiur, one who takes out less than the requisite amount of something. The kodem shianicho nitpach v'chazar kashiur, before you have a chance to put it down, it blows up in size. Sometimes the weather can affect it, hot weather shrinks, cold weather expands. So it's sitting in your hand and it expands. And now it's the size of the requisite amount. The opposite. You take out an amount that's requisite amount. In your hand it shrinks, and now it's less than the amount. Patur, now you're exempt. You haven't taken a full transfer of a proper amount. Somebody who carries the volume of a dried fig of something for eating purposes. it shrinks before you put it down, but now in your mind you change the purpose. You now intend to use it for planting or for medicinal purposes, which now no longer requires that full amount. Now you're held liable using the intent that you had at the time that you put it down. Because when you picked it up, it was done in a forbidden way, and when you placed it, it was done in a forbidden way. The opposite case. You picked up less than the requisite amount, having in mind to use it for planting, in which case you're liable. And before you put it down, you change your mind and think about it for eating. Since it remains less than the size of a dried fig, patur, you are exempt. Were it to blow up before putting it down, and it turned into the size of a dried fig before you changed your mind and used it for human consumption, you're liable. Even if you didn't change your mind, you'd still be held liable for the fact that you had in mind to take something out. And therefore, in this case, you're going to be held liable biblically. Let's say you took out the size of a dried fig for human consumption, you're fully liable. In your hand, as you're walking, it shrinks. And it re-expands before you put it down. Says the Rambam based on the Talmud, we're in doubt now whether this item was rejected from being the requisite amount or not since it returned. And therefore we can't hold you biblically liable. Let's say you threw the size of an olive of food into an impure home. There was other food sitting on the floor of that house. By throwing it in, now you've made the total amount of food here the size of an egg. When it comes to the laws of Tum'ah, as we're going to see in the 10th book of the Rambam, having an egg size of food is enough to contract ritual impurity. By you throwing in less than the amount, the kazayit of food into the house, you've done something beneficial in that you've created the total amount of food in the home to be an egg size. Says the Rambam, it's a doubt whether we can hold you liable on this olive size because you've now completed the amount and made it befitting to contract ritual impurity, or perhaps you're not liable since in the realm of Shabbat you've done nothing beneficial. A fascinating halacha. Somebody carries less than the requisite amount of a food, even though you're carrying it in a bowl. And technically you should be liable on account of the bowl, patur, you are exempt. Shahakli tfeila lo. Because in this case, all you want to get out of the house is the food. So the bowl in which you're carrying it becomes secondary to it. Your intent is not to remove the bowl, it's to remove what's in the bowl. And the food in the bowl doesn't have the requisite amount. So the Rebbe used this halacha as a classic example of the fact that Torah reckons only with what a person's true kavanah is. If something is not considered an entity according to the Torah, in other words, if in your thought you don't care about the bowl, Torah doesn't recognize the bowl, it only recognizes the food. It's also an example that Rebbe has a whole long talk about kamut ve'ichut, quantity and quality. Here you see you can convert quantity into quality. Because your intent is only on the small quantity, that becomes the main qualitative factor, and for everything else you're held exempt. Lefichach, therefore, says the Rambam, im hotzi adam chai, she'eino kafut b'mitah, if a person were to carry another live person, not tied up, in a bed, for a live person, you're not held liable. The live person carries his own weight. You're carrying him on a bed, patur afal hamitah, you're exempt also for the bed. Sha'amitat tfeila lo, because the bed is considered secondary to the person, your intent is to only take out the person. The same applies to all similar situations. Hamotzi kupat harochlim, somebody who takes out the box of the perfumer. Perfumers used to use actual spices in creating different incense mixes, and you carry out this entire box. Afal pi sheyesh ba minin harbe, even though there's many types of spices in the box, va'afilu hotzian betoch kapo, and even if you took it into your hand, you're holding many different spices in your hand, we don't hold you liable for every individual spice. Eno chayav ela achat. In this case, you're only held liable once. Shem hotza'a achat hi, because you've only performed a single act of transfer, even though you've transferred 25 things, but you've done only one act of transferring the perfumer's box, and that is what you're held liable for.